Welcome to HOA Clapback. This one escalated fast in the front yard. I am standing in the guest parking lot of my own complex, and Michelle Lewis, the Community Standards Chair for the Stonegate Reserve Village Association, is 2 feet from my face screaming that guests cannot be residents even temporarily. My car is legally parked in a guest spot because my assigned space got flooded last night after a storm dumped 3 inches in 20 minutes. And now she is telling me I have 15 minutes before she calls the tow company. I am an apartment maintenance supervisor. I have seen every kind of complaint, and this one is already the dumbest fight I have ever had with an HOA. I just moved to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho 6 weeks ago because the pay was better and the mountains are close, and the Stonegate Reserve Village Association advertises itself as a quiet, professional community with modern amenities and responsive management. What they do not advertise is that Michelle, who everyone calls Debra because she insists on it, treats the guest parking rules like a personal battlefield and invents guidelines on the fly whenever she wants to punish someone. She is wearing a gray light jacket, a pink baseball cap, and a tiny body camera clipped to her jacket that she taps every time she wants to remind me she is recording. I have safety glasses pushed up on my head because I was in the middle of fixing a sink when she banged on my door 10 minutes ago, and I am still holding my phone because I started recording the second she opened her mouth. She leans in closer and says, "I have all day, and so does my fine meter." That is her catchphrase. She says it like it is a threat that should make me fold, and maybe it works on other people, but I need this resolved fast because I am trying to refinance my place, and any lien threat could wreck the deal. My lender already asked for an HOA certificate, and if Deborah decides to add a collections flag before I close, the whole thing falls apart. I take a breath and say, the rules say guest parking is available to residents when their assigned spots are unusable. She shakes her head hard enough that her pixie cut whips around and says, "That is not what the Community Standards Guideline says." I ask her to show me the guideline. She taps her body camera and says, "I do not need to show you anything. I am the standards chair, and I enforce what the board directs." I can feel my jaw tightening because she just admitted she is making it up, and I know this is going to get worse before it gets better. Behind us, a landscaping contractor is unloading tools from his truck and pretending not to listen, but I can see him glance over every few seconds. Deborah notices too and raises her voice even louder. She says, "You are abusing guest parking and taking spots from actual guests, and if you do not move your car right now, I am filing a violation and calling the tow vendor." I ask her what actual guests are waiting, because the lot is half empty, and there are 4 open guest spots within 20 feet of where we are standing. She ignores the question and pulls out her phone, and I realize she is serious. I say, "Hold on, my assigned spot is underwater. Maintenance has not pumped it yet, and the rules explicitly allow temporary use of guest spots in cases like this." She cuts me off and says, "I have done this before and people fold every time." That line hits me wrong, because it is not about rules anymore, it is about power, and I can tell she has been doing this long enough that most people just give up. I am not folding. I tell her I am going to file a formal complaint with the management company and request a board review, and she laughs and says the board backs her on every decision because she keeps the property values high. I do not believe that for a second, but I also know arguing in a parking lot is not going to solve anything. I take a step back and say, "Fine, I will move the car, but I am documenting this and I am going to challenge the guideline you are citing." She smiles and taps her body camera again and says, "Good luck with that." Then she walks away, and I stand there for a minute just breathing and trying to figure out my next move. I move my car back to my assigned spot, even though there is still standing water up to the door sill, and I spend the rest of the morning pulling the floor mats and running a fan to dry it out. The whole time I am thinking about what Deborah said, that she has done this before and people fold. That tells me she has a pattern, and if I can find other people she has targeted, I might be able to build a case. I text my buddy Jason, a local paralegal who helped me with my lease review when I moved in, and I ask him if he knows anything about the Stonegate Reserve Village Association. He texts back 20 minutes later and says he has heard the name before, that they are known for being aggressive with violations, and that the management company is not great at reining them in. He offers to help me organize evidence if I want to push back, and I tell him I definitely want to push back, because this is not just about a parking spot anymore. It is about Deborah thinking she can bully anyone who questions her. Jason says he will pull the HOA bylaws and meeting minutes from the county records and see if there's anything useful. I thank him and get back to work, but the whole day feels off because I keep expecting another knock on the door. That evening I get home, and there is a red stamped final notice envelope taped to my door. I rip it open, and inside is a violation notice saying I used guest parking without authorization, and I owe a $50 fine, payable within 10 days or it doubles. The notice is dated today, which means Deborah filed it the second she walked away from me this morning. There is no appeals process listed, just a line that says failure to pay will result in collections action and a lien on the property. I take a picture of the envelope and the notice and text it to Jason, and he calls me back immediately. He says, "This is classic HOA intimidation. They are trying to scare you into paying before you have time to challenge it." He tells me to write a formal dispute letter citing the bylaws and send it certified mail to both the management company and the board president, and to keep every piece of paper, because if this goes to small claims, I am going to need a timeline. I ask him if he thinks it will actually go that far, and he laughs and says, "With HOAs like this, always assume it will." I hang up and start drafting the letter, and halfway through I get another text from Jason. He says he found something interesting in the meeting minutes, and he wants to show me tomorrow. I ask him what it is, and he just says, "Bring coffee. You are going to need it." The next morning I meet Jason at a coffee shop near the complex, and he slides a folder across the table before I even sit down. Inside are printed copies of board meeting minutes going back 6 months, and he has highlighted a bunch of lines in yellow. He points to one from 3 months ago and says, "Look at this. The board voted to update the guest parking rules, but the vote failed because they did not have a quorum." Then 2 weeks later, Deborah sent an email to the management company saying the new rules were approved and she would begin enforcement immediately. There is no record of a second vote, no record of a quorum being achieved, and no formal resolution in the minutes. Jason taps the page and says, "She just decided the rules changed and started enforcing them anyway." I lean back and let that sink in, because it means every violation she has issued under the new guideline is invalid, and if I can prove that in front of the board or in court, the whole thing collapses. I ask Jason if he thinks this is enough to get the fine reversed, and he says it is enough to demand a hearing and force them to show their work. He also says I should file a complaint with the state, because enforcing rules without a valid vote is a breach of fiduciary duty, but that is a slow process, and it will not stop Deborah from escalating in the meantime. I ask him what he means by escalating, and he says, "She is going to target you harder now because you are not folding. So expect more violations, more fees, and probably an attempt to tow your car the next time you slip up." I feel my stomach drop, because that is exactly the kind of pressure I cannot afford right now, not with the refinance hanging in the balance. Jason sees my face and says, "Do not panic. Just keep documenting everything and stay one step ahead of her." I nod and thank him, and he says he will keep digging through the minutes to see if there are other examples of Deborah overstepping. I leave the coffee shop feeling better, but also knowing this fight is about to get a lot messier. That afternoon, I send the dispute letter certified mail, and I include a copy of the meeting minutes showing the failed vote. I also send a separate letter to the management company asking for a formal review of all guest parking enforcement actions over the past 6 months, and I request copies of any resolutions or policy changes related to guest parking. I do not expect them to respond quickly, but I want everything on the record. 2 days later, I get a call from the management company, and the woman on the phone sounds annoyed before she even says hello. She tells me my dispute has been received and it will be reviewed at the next board meeting in 3 weeks. I ask her if the fine is suspended pending the review, and she says no. The fine stands until the board rules otherwise. I push back and say the enforcement was based on a rule that was never validly adopted, and she cuts me off and says, "That is for the board to decide, not me." Then she hangs up. I sit there staring at my phone and realizing the management company is just going to rubber stamp whatever Debra wants, which means I need to go over their heads. I text Jason and tell him what happened, and he says time to lawyer up, even if it is just a consult. He gives me the name of an attorney who does HOA disputes, and I call and leave a message. The attorney calls back that evening and says she can meet with me next week, and in the meantime I should keep collecting evidence and avoid doing anything that gives Debra more ammunition. I agree and hang up, and then I spend the next hour going through my phone and organizing every photo, text, and recording I have from the past 2 weeks. The following Monday, I am walking out to my car to head to work, and there is a bright orange wheel boot clamped onto my front driver's side tire. I stop in my tracks because I parked in my assigned spot. I paid my HOA dues on time, and there is no reason for this. Taped to my windshield is a notice that says the boot was placed due to multiple unresolved violations, and it will not be removed until all fines are paid in full, plus a $75 boot removal fee. I rip the notice off and look around, and Debra is standing by the mailbox cluster with her arms crossed and a huge smile on her face. She waves at me and says, "I told you I have all day." I walk over to her and say, "You booted my car in my assigned spot. That is not legal." She shrugs and says, "The vendor is authorized to boot any vehicle with outstanding violations, and you have 2. I ask her what the second violation is, and she pulls out her phone and shows me a photo of my car parked in a guest spot 3 days ago. I was not in a guest spot 3 days ago. I was in my assigned spot, and I tell her that. She zooms in on the photo and says, "That is your license plate." I look closer and realize the photo is from a completely different angle than where I was parked, and the timestamp is wrong by 4 hours. I say, "This photo is fake. You staged this." She laughs and says, "Prove it." Then she walks away, and I am left standing next to my booted car with no way to get to work, and a growing sense that this is not just about parking anymore. This is personal. I call the tow company number on the boot notice, and a guy answers and says he cannot remove the boot until I pay all outstanding fines and the removal fee, and payment has to go through the HOA management company. I tell him the fines are under dispute, and I have proof the violations are invalid, and he says, "Not my problem. Take it up with the HOA." Then he hangs up. I call the management company and get the same annoyed woman from before, and she says the boot will not be removed until the fines are paid, and there is no exception for disputes. I ask her how I am supposed to get to work, and she says, "That is not the association's responsibility." I hang up before I say something I will regret, and then I call Jason. He listens to the whole story and then says, "This is harassment, and it is probably illegal depending on how the boot contract is written." He tells me to take photos of the boot, the notice, and the timestamp on Debra's staged photo, and to file a police report for fraudulent evidence and property damage. I ask him if the police will actually do anything, and he says probably not, but it gets the incident on record, and that matters if this goes to court. I take the photos and drive to the police station in my partner's car, and I file a report. The officer who takes the statement seems sympathetic, but says this sounds like a civil matter, and I should talk to a lawyer. I tell him I already have one, and he gives me an incident number and says to keep all the documentation. I thank him and leave, and on the way out I text Jason the incident number. He replies, "Good. Now we have proof you tried to handle this the right way." That evening I meet with the attorney Jason recommended, and I bring everything: the meeting minutes, the dispute letters, the boot notice, the staged photo, the police report, and the timeline I have been building. She goes through it all methodically, and after about 20 minutes she looks up and says, "You have a really strong case, but you need to understand that HOAs like this do not back down easily. They will drag this out, they will try to intimidate you, and they will definitely try to hit you with more fees before this is over." She says my best option is to demand a formal hearing in front of the board and present the evidence there, and if they rule against me, file in small claims court and ask for damages, attorney fees, and injunctive relief to stop further enforcement. I ask her how long that takes, and she says could be months, maybe longer if they appeal. I feel the weight of that because months means the refinance is dead, and I tell her that. She nods and says, "Then we need to move fast and put pressure on them to settle before it gets that far." She drafts a demand letter on the spot, and it lays out the invalid vote, the staged photo, the harassment, and the police report, and it demands immediate removal of the boot, reversal of all fines, and a formal apology. It also says if the HOA does not comply within 72 hours, I will file in small claims and pursue damages. She sends it certified mail that night, and I leave her office feeling like I finally have some leverage. 2 days later, the boot is still on my car, and I have not heard anything from the HOA or the management company. I text Jason, and he says, "They are calling your bluff. They think you will not actually file." I tell him I am absolutely going to file, and he says, "Good. Let's do it today." We drive to the courthouse, and I fill out the small claims paperwork, and I include the demand letter, the meeting minutes, the staged photo, the boot notice, and the police report. The filing fee is $85, and the clerk tells me the hearing will be scheduled in about 6 weeks. I ask if there is any way to get an emergency order to remove the boot, and she says I can file a separate motion, but it is not guaranteed. I file the motion anyway, and Jason helps me write a short brief explaining that the boot is preventing me from working and the underlying violations are fraudulent. The judge reviews it the next day and denies the motion, saying it is a civil dispute and I have not shown immediate irreparable harm. I am furious, but Jason says, "At least now they know you are serious, and that might make them settle." I hope he is right because I am running out of options. The next morning I wake up to my phone buzzing nonstop, and when I check it, I see a group text from Deborah to the entire Stonegate Reserve Village Association. The message says, "Reminder, residents who abuse guest parking or fail to comply with community standards will be subject to immediate enforcement, including towing, booting, and suspension of amenity access. Effective immediately, any resident with unresolved violations is banned from the clubhouse, pool, and fitness center until all fines are paid." The message is clearly aimed at me, and I can feel my blood pressure spiking because she is now trying to publicly shame me and cut me off from amenities I pay for in my HOA dues. I screenshot the message and forward it to Jason and the attorney replies, "This is retaliatory, and it strengthens your case." She tells me not to respond to the group text and to let her handle it. An hour later, she sends another demand letter, this time with a copy of the group text and a line that says, "Further retaliatory actions will result in additional claims for emotional distress and punitive damages." I do not know if that is legally strong, but it feels good to see it in writing. That afternoon, I am at the mailbox cluster picking up my mail, and a neighbor I have never met before walks up and says, "Hey, are you the guy fighting with Deborah?" I nod and he says, "Good, because she has been pulling this kind of thing for 2 years and no one has ever stood up to her." He tells me she targeted him last year over a parking decal that was supposedly expired, and she had his car towed from his own assigned spot while he was out of town. By the time he got back, the tow fees were over $300 and the HOA refused to reimburse him. He says he paid it just to get his car back, but he has regretted it ever since. I ask him if he still has any of the paperwork, and he says he might, and he will look for it. I give him my number and tell him to text me if he finds anything, because the more people who have been screwed by Deborah, the stronger my case gets. He says he will ask around and see if anyone else wants to talk, and then he leaves. I stand there for a minute feeling a little less alone, because up until now it has felt like I am the only one fighting back. That night I get a text from the neighbor, and he sends me photos of his tow receipt and a violation notice from Deborah. The dates match up with what he told me, and the violation notice says his decal was expired even though his photo shows the decal was valid for another 3 months. I forward everything to the attorney and she replies, "This is gold. It shows a pattern of fraudulent enforcement." She asks if I can get him to testify at the small claims hearing, and I text him and ask. He says he will think about it, but he is nervous because he still lives here and he does not want Deborah to target him again. I understand, but I also tell him that if we do not stop her now, she is just going to keep doing this to other people. He says he will let me know. A week later, I get a notice in the mail that the board hearing on my dispute is scheduled for next Thursday at 7 in the evening in the clubhouse. The notice says I have 10 minutes to present my case, and the board will vote immediately after. I call the attorney and she says she cannot attend because she has another commitment, but she will prep me and give me a script to follow. We spend an hour on the phone going over the key points, the invalid vote, the staged photo, the retaliatory group text, and the pattern of fraudulent enforcement. She tells me to stay calm, stick to the facts, and do not let Deborah bait me into an argument. I write everything down and practice it a few times, and by the end of the week I feel as ready as I am going to be. The night of the hearing I show up 15 minutes early and the clubhouse is already packed. There are maybe 30 people in the room, and Deborah is at the front table with 3 other board members. She sees me walk in and smiles, and I can tell she thinks this is going to be easy for her. I take a seat in the back and pull out my folder, and Jason slides into the seat next to me. He flew in this morning as a surprise and says he would not miss this. I feel a wave of relief because having him here makes me feel less outnumbered. The board president calls the meeting to order and runs through some routine business, and then he says, "Next item is the appeal filed by Unit 214 regarding guest parking violations." He looks at me and says, "You have 10 minutes, starting now." I stand up and walk to the front, and I can feel everyone watching me. I take a breath and start talking. I lay out the timeline, starting with the flooded parking spot and Deborah's claim that guests cannot be residents even temporarily. I show the meeting minutes with the failed vote and explain that the rule she enforced was never validly adopted. I show the staged photo with the wrong timestamp and explain that it is fraudulent evidence. I show the retaliatory group text and the boot notice, and I explain that this is a pattern of harassment designed to bully me into paying fines I do not owe. I finish by saying, I did not come here to fight. I came here because I followed the rules and I was punished anyway. and I deserve a fair process. The room is silent for a second, and then Deborah stands up and says, "That is a very creative story, but the fact is you violated the guest parking rules multiple times and you have refused to pay the fines. The board has full authority to enforce community standards, and if you do not like it, you can move." I feel my hands clench because she just admitted she does not care about the evidence. But before I can respond, Jason stands up and says, "Actually, the board does not have authority to enforce rules that were never adopted, and fraudulent evidence is not a valid basis for enforcement." The room erupts in murmurs, and the board president bangs his gavel and says, "Sir, you are not recognized. Please sit down." Jason sits, but the damage is done, because now everyone is talking and Deborah looks rattled. The board president says, "We will take this under advisement and vote at the end of the meeting." I ask when I will be notified of the decision, and he says, "Within 5 business days." I nod and walk back to my seat, and Jason leans over and says, "You crushed it." I do not feel like I crushed it. I feel like I just poured gasoline on a fire, but I nod anyway. The rest of the meeting is routine stuff, and then at the end the board president says, "We will now vote on the appeal." Deborah immediately says, "I move to deny the appeal and uphold all fines and enforcement actions." Another board member seconds it, and they vote. 3 yes, 1 abstain. The appeal is denied. I feel my chest tighten because I knew this was possible, but it still hurts to see it happen. Jason puts a hand on my shoulder and says, "Small claims, here we come." I nod and we walk out, and behind us I can hear Deborah laughing. The next morning I get an email from the management company saying the boot will remain in place until all fines are paid, and failure to pay within 10 days will result in a lien being filed against my property. I forward it to the attorney, and she replies, "File an amended complaint in small claims and add the lien threat." I do, and I also add a request for a restraining order to stop further enforcement pending the hearing. The judge reviews it and grants a temporary order, and the HOA is notified that they cannot take any further action until after the hearing. I feel a tiny bit of relief, but I also know this is far from over. 2 weeks later, I am at work and I get a call from Jason. He says, "You need to see this." I ask what, and he says, "Just meet me at the coffee shop now." I tell my boss I have an emergency and I leave. And 20 minutes later, I am sitting across from Jason and he is showing me a spreadsheet on his laptop. He says, "I got this from a friend who works at the management company. It is a list of residents Deborah has targeted over the past 2 years, and your address is highlighted. There are 15 other addresses on the list, all with notes like parking decal issue, guest spot abuse, amenity ban, and tow authorized." Jason points to the notes column and says, "This is proof she is running a targeted harassment campaign, and the management company knows about it." I lean back and let that sink in because it means this is not just Deborah going rogue. This is institutional. And if I can get this spreadsheet into evidence, it is game over for them. Jason says, "I already sent a copy to your attorney, and she is going to subpoena the management company for the full records." I thank him and he says, "Do not thank me yet. This is going to get uglier before it gets better." If you are enjoying this chaos, smash that like button and subscribe, because HOA stories only get wilder from here. He is right. The next day I get a call from the attorney and she says the management company is fighting the subpoena and claiming the spreadsheet is privileged internal communication. She says she is going to file a motion to compel, but it will take time. I ask her if we can use the copy Jason got, and she says not officially, but we can reference it in our arguments and force them to either produce it or admit it exists. I tell her to do whatever she thinks is best, and she says she will keep me updated. I hang up and sit there feeling like I am in the middle of a legal thriller, except it is my real life and the stakes are my home and my credit. A week before the small claims hearing, I get a text from the neighbor who gave me his tow receipt. He says, I talked to 3 other people who got screwed by Deborah, and they all want to help. He gives me their contact info and I reach out, and within 2 days I have statements from all of them. One guy had his car towed for parking in a fire lane that was not marked. Another woman got fined for a guest who stayed 1 hour past the 24-hour limit. And a third person got booted for a decal that was supposedly the wrong color even though it came from the HOA office. Every single one of them has paperwork showing Deborah lied or fabricated evidence, and every single one of them is willing to testify. I send everything to the attorney and she calls me back within an hour and says, "This is incredible. We are going to bury them." I feel a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. The night before the hearing, I barely sleep because I keep running through the arguments in my head. Jason stays over and we go through the evidence one more time. And he says, "You have got this. Just stay calm and let the facts do the work." I nod and try to believe him. The next morning we drive to the courthouse and the attorney meets us in the hallway. She looks confident and says, "I filed a motion yesterday to admit the spreadsheet as evidence, and the judge granted it. The HOA is going to lose their minds when they see it, so be ready for fireworks." I nod and we walk into the courtroom, and I see Deborah sitting on the other side with the board president and a guy in a suit who I assume is their attorney. Deborah sees me and her face hardens, and I can tell she knows something has changed. The judge calls the case and asks for opening statements. The attorney for the HOA stands up and says, "This is a simple case of a resident who refused to follow community rules and is now trying to weaponize the legal system to avoid paying legitimate fines." He says the HOA has full authority to enforce parking rules, and the board acted within its discretion. Then he sits down. My attorney stands up and says, "Your Honor, this is a case of systemic harassment, fraudulent enforcement, and retaliation by an HOA that has been targeting residents for years. We have meeting minutes showing the parking rule was never validly adopted. We have evidence of staged photos and fabricated violations. And we have a leaked internal spreadsheet that proves the defendant maintained a target list of residents to harass." She pauses and says, "We also have 4 additional witnesses who will testify to the same pattern of behavior." The judge raises an eyebrow and says, "Proceed." My attorney calls me to the stand first and I walk through the entire timeline, starting with the flooded parking spot and ending with the lien threat. I show the meeting minutes, the staged photo, the boot notice, and the retaliatory group text. The HOA attorney tries to object a few times, but the judge overrules him every time. Then my attorney shows the spreadsheet and asks me to identify my address. I point it out and explain that the spreadsheet proves I was targeted as part of a pattern. The HOA attorney stands up and says, "Objection. This document is hearsay and its authenticity has not been established." The judge says, "Overruled. I will allow it." The HOA attorney sits down looking furious, and I can see Deborah whispering something to him. Next, my attorney calls the neighbor who gave me his tow receipt, and he testifies about Deborah towing his car for an expired decal that was not actually expired. Then she calls the other 3 witnesses, and one by one they describe the same pattern: fraudulent violations, fabricated evidence, and retaliatory enforcement. By the time the 4th witness is done, the judge is leaning forward and taking notes, and the HOA attorney looks like he wants to crawl under the table. Deborah is sitting there with her arms crossed and her face bright red, and I can tell she knows this is not going the way she planned. The HOA attorney calls Deborah to the stand and she tries to defend herself, but every answer just makes it worse. My attorney asks her about the meeting minutes and the failed vote, and Debra says, the board gave me verbal approval to enforce the updated rules. My attorney says, so there is no written record of that approval? Debra says no, but the board knew what I was doing. My attorney says, and yet the minutes show the vote failed and no second vote was ever held. Debra does not have an answer for that. Then my attorney shows her the staged photo and asks her to explain the timestamp, and Debra says, I may have gotten the time wrong, but the violation was real. My attorney says, so you admit the evidence you provided was inaccurate? Debra says, it was a mistake. My attorney says, a convenient mistake that supported your enforcement action. The judge cuts in and says, Miss Lewis, did you or did you not verify the accuracy of the evidence before issuing the violation? Debra hesitates and then says, I did my best. The judge does not look impressed. After both sides rest, the judge takes a 10-minute recess and then comes back with a decision. He says, I find that the plaintiff has proven by a preponderance of the evidence that the parking rule in question was never validly adopted, that the violations issued were based on inaccurate and in some cases fabricated evidence, and that the enforcement actions taken by the defendant were retaliatory and harassing in nature. I am ordering the defendant to immediately remove the boot from the plaintiff's vehicle, reverse all fines and fees, reimburse the plaintiff for filing costs and attorney fees, and adopt a clear parking and towing policy with a neutral appeal process and proof standards. I am also ordering the defendant to pay damages in the amount of $2,000 for emotional distress and harassment. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent injunction prohibiting the defendant from taking any further enforcement action against the plaintiff without written board approval and documented evidence. The courtroom is silent for a second, and then I hear Jason let out a quiet yes behind me. The judge bangs his gavel and says, case closed. I stand up and shake my attorney's hand, and she says, you did it. I feel like I just ran a marathon, but I also feel lighter than I have in weeks. Outside the courthouse, Jason and I stand on the steps and he says, that was the most satisfying thing I have ever seen. I laugh and say, I could not have done it without you. He says, yeah, you could have, but I am glad I got to watch Debra implode. We drive back to the complex, and the first thing I do is call the tow company and tell them the judge ordered the boot removed. They send someone out within an hour. And watching that orange clamp come off my tire is one of the best moments of my life. The guy removing it says, for what it is worth, we get a lot of complaints about this HOA. I tell him I am working on fixing that, and he laughs and drives away. That evening I get a call from the HOA board president. He sounds exhausted and says, I want to apologize for how this was handled. The board has accepted Debra's resignation as Community Standards Chair, and we are implementing the policy changes the judge ordered. We are also reviewing all enforcement actions from the past 2 years and reversing any that were improperly issued. He says the management company is being replaced, and the new one will have stricter oversight. I thank him and say, I appreciate that, but this should never have happened in the first place. He says, you are right, and I am sorry. We hang up and I sit there for a minute processing the fact that it is actually over. A few days later, I get a check in the mail from the HOA for the $2,000 in damages, plus reimbursement for all my costs. I also get a formal letter saying all fines and violations have been reversed, and my record is clear. I text Jason a photo of the check and he replies, frame that. I laugh and say, I might. That weekend I run into the neighbor who first told me about his town nightmare, and he says, I heard you won. Thank you for doing what the rest of us were too scared to do. I tell him I just got lucky, and he says, no, you did not. You fought back and you won. Other neighbors start coming up to me over the next few weeks, thanking me and asking for advice on their own HOA disputes. I give them the attorney's contact info and tell them to document everything, and I can see the relief on their faces knowing someone finally stood up. A month later, I close on my refinance without any issues, and the lender tells me the HOA certificate came back clean. I feel a huge weight lift because that was the whole reason I had to fight so hard in the first place. I text the attorney and thank her again, and she says, "You were a great client, and I am glad it worked out." She also says, "If you ever want to write up your story and share it, I think a lot of people could learn from it." I tell her I will think about it, and that night I sit down and start writing everything out, partly for myself, and partly so other people know they do not have to take this kind of treatment. Looking back, the craziest part is that it all started with a flooded parking spot and a guest space. DeBurr thought she could bully me into paying fines I did not owe, and she thought I would fold like everyone else. What she did not know was that I did not play my hand yet, and she thought that meant I had none. When I finally dropped the board meeting minutes and the quorum log proving the vote was invalid, and when I handed copies to Jason first so we could present together and Karen could not isolate me, the whole thing collapsed. An insurance risk warning from the HOA attorney that made the board panic forced a reversal to reduce liability, and Karen's staged photos got used against her in court. She demanded proof and then panicked when I handed out copies to everyone in that courtroom, and watching her face when the judge read the ruling was worth every second of the fight. The best part is knowing that the new parking policy has actual proof standards and a real appeal process, so no one else has to go through what I went through. The Stonegate Reserve Village Association is not perfect, but it is better than it was, and that feels like a real win. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.